What's up? We're here in Whistler. We've got a bunch of trail bikes for our fall field test. First one up, Ibis Ripmo. Carbon frame, dual 29-inch wheels. You can also run it as a mullet. It's got an air shock with 150 mils of travel. You can also swap that out for a coil. It's got a 160 mil fork. That gives a 64.5 degree head tube angle. Our size large weighs, actually our size extra medium weighs 32 pounds, 7 ounces. Ibis says this is the ultimate trail slaying machine. We've been riding it for about 2 weeks, so we're gonna kick off the review with our first impressions.
Oh my God, oh my God. I haven't bed my brakes in yet. I'm noticing that most of all. Yeah, it feels good. It feels a little fluttery. Oh, right into the hole. Turns out adding a lot of compression to this fork makes it way better. All right, I like this thing.
Yeah?
Yeah, cool. I'm pretty happy. Hi, Mike. I just had a pretty scary deflect in that higher speed section. I don't really know what. All right, this feels less good than it did. This bike feels very busy. I will say it's more consistent than the Bronson, at least right now, in these bumps. Wow, these brakes are not enough for this bike. That feels comfortable. You've got our first impressions on the Ripmo. We're now going to answer some questions and get a little bit deeper into how the bike rides.
That was wholly underwhelming.
Good enough. It got close. Let's appreciate this one. This is nice. Let's stick that there. Oh, it's filled with a bunch of ripped pieces. The Ripmo.
Oh, there we go. Nice.
All right.
What were the 3 words?
First 3 words were mine. It says,
I'll tell you. You said comfortable, ooh, compromised, and ready. So comfortable, that's pretty easy to discern what that means. Compromised. How, why, what?
I think I stand by that one. It feels like a bike that could be more than what it is, but isn't that. There's like things holding it back from full potential.
Well, let's then hit that nail on the head. This is a bike currently being raced by Mr. Greg Callaghan on the AWS in a full 29 mode with a big old fork.
To great effect.
To great effect. That isn't the setup that we're reviewing
Not at all.
here today.
Yeah.
And our impressions might seem to almost contradict.
Right, like I wanted to ride his and be like, what's the difference, dog? Yeah.
The last word you used was ready. Ready for what?
I don't know, ready to go. It's just like, I hopped on it and immediately was like, okay, I can ride this bike. Yeah. It didn't feel like it required too much faff, but even after the test sessions now, I haven't really found it got much beyond that initial feeling. I was like, okay, this is like rideable, good, like comfortable, but not like pushing.
DW bikes, or bikes with a DW links, are often considered to climb really, really well. Is this true with this Ibis?
I think it feels like a very energetic climber, and I think that's typically the feeling associated with those bikes. You know, they give a lot back as you put into it. You know, you're spinning along, it feels efficient and carries you along. I think it starts to suffer a little bit in rougher and more awkward climbing scenarios.
Could you describe what you mean by suffer? What's happening there?
There's an element of like, when the bike is set up well to feel efficient and lively, it starts feeling too active and kind of almost bouncy in those, you know, more undulating and rough climbing scenarios.
Yeah, it does feel like it has a wheel that, yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because in some ways, this bike, you'd almost want to set it up differently for the climbs and the descents.
A little bit,
I don't know what that is, but and it's
you could slow it down a lot for the climbs,
yes,
and it would feel more composed, but then it would feel horrible on the descents.
Yeah, you know, it does feel like it can offer a lot of grip, especially in the seated position.
Yeah.
But also how it handles your mass when you want to move that around, or how the trail's going. It kind of feels not overwhelmed, but it doesn't quite know what to do with you.
Yeah, a little bit. It's moving you more than it's moving the wheel.
Yeah, I mean, this then leads us on to the next question. Does this feel like a settled climber?
Yeah, again, I think you can set it up to feel that way, but you'd be taking away from where it would excel otherwise. So I think, to me, it's more kind of caught between things.
Yeah.
So I don't think in its like optimal setup it feels very settled now.
No, I would agree with that. It's interesting because when you descend this bike, and we'll talk a lot more about it later, but I found it hard to reach full stroke.
Me too.
Which would typically suggest that, oh, you can run the bike softer. But actually the thing I wouldn't want to run it softer for is that sort of flutteriness at the beginning to middle of the stroke.
Right.
Especially on medium-sized hits. How's the body position on climbs? And I think this is a really interesting question, but do you want to have a run at it?
It feels more traditional than some of the other bikes we have. Like the front end is a bit lower, partially just to do with the cockpit that came on the bike. The seat angle is kind of in line with a lot of the others. It feels a bit more like you're pointed at things and it's encouraging you to like stay low over the bike and pedal hard as opposed to pick your way through challenging sections. The suspension rides quite high, and I think naturally the fork sat a bit lower. At least that was my ride feel of it. So it does feel a bit like the bike is leaning forward on climbs, and that's kind of a nice thing in like steeper seated climbing scenarios. Though when it's rougher and kind of more awkward, it does feel like the bike is pushing you forward a bit.
Yeah,
and that
absolutely.
can be kind of funky feeling. Our first descending question is, does this descend like an EWS race bike?
Well, that's something they say right in the copy straight off the bat.
They do, and apropos of what you opened with, Callaghan is racing this in a very different build, but this frame is currently an EWS race bike.
Yeah, I would say if I was positioning what the Ibis Ripmo is, I wouldn't lead with that. Do you know?
Yeah.
It feels like to some people it's probably going to really fit in with what they consider a trail bike really to be.
Yep.
So my response to that would be, this is a really good example kind of what a trail bike was. Comparing it to something like the Spectral, which on paper seems like quite a similar bike, but what they get at the Spectral, they manage to really, ring that for all it's worth.
Agreed.
This, it feels a little less confidence inspiring, a little less straight off the bat, you get on it, and it's funny, we're doing some bike park laps on, appropriate terrain, but it was lift accessed, and straight off the Upper Creek side into that starter freight train just before you peel off. I mean, you're aware that this is not as capable as some of the other bikes on test.
It feels sharper, for sure. I think, sometimes that sharper handling characteristic can be nice. To me, it was more like that plus an uneasy suspension feeling led to something that was, maybe more reactive than you'd want out of a bike that you're bringing into a blind racing scenario.
Which is, what's interesting is they say that on one half about this EWS, but then, and we don't want to get bogged down in the spec too much in these reviews, but there were so many concessions on this bike which took it away from its descending capabilities. We're going to talk about the fork. It's the weird things. It's like the slightly older style SRAM rotors, which just give
small
less
rotors.
braking power.
Yeah, a lot of decisions were made for maybe weight on this bike that take away from its abilities. I think up and down.
Yeah.
All right, move on to the next question from the Peanut Gallery. Why does this bike feel so small?
Why does this bike feel so small? It's the extra medium, which is actually something that Matt Beer referred to in a previous article about frame size. But then the large is an absolutely massive bike. It's like 505.
So for reference, like this bike is a 478 reach. The next size up is a 505. Stack heights change a little bit less than 10 mil between the two. And the rear center changes by like 2 millimeters, I think. So it really is just a reach change between the two. I found this bike fit okay. Like I'm the tallest on the team here. It didn't feel like a little like monkey bike to me, but it feels low. As I alluded to in the climbing, like it has this kind of like pushed forward sensation. And I think part of that is the cockpit of the bike, and we'll talk a bit about that in our garage impressions, but it doesn't give you the more upright feel that a lot of the other bikes allow for.
Some bikes, they put you in a position, maybe to the detriment on some other stuff. For instance, like the Troy and the Bunsen, which are arguably more of the sort of aggressive end of the spectrum of these trail bikes.
Right.
But they put you in like kind of a commanding position. This bike does not put you in a commanding position.
Yeah, I think part of it is we keep talking about like the support you get out of that shock, or like the tendency for it to want to ride high. I think that lends itself here, where like you look at something like the Spectral or the Stump Jumper, both want to sit in a bit. Like the Spectral maintains ride height fairly well, but it controls the rate at which you plunge into it in a better way than the Ripmo.
Absolutely.
And as a result, you don't feel like you're like seesawing quite as much. And I feel like the Ripmo can kind of get that like pitching sensation, or the Spectral, which is almost the same geometry, doesn't give you that sensation.
The Spectra is a vastly more confident aspiring bike to my mind.
I found so as well.
It felt more balanced between the wheels. It felt like it could just handle more. You know, this bike does have a different damper to pretty much all the other Fox bikes on
Right, this is the Grip X damper, where all the other Fox forks are either the Grip X2, which is the kind of beefier damper, or the Grip 2.
And the really good thing about the Grip X damper is that on your $10,000 mountain bike that's meant to be riding over all these places, it saves 100 grams, and all it does is undermine how confident you feel, which is a great trade-off for me. I would 100 grams, take the chain out of my pocket, you know. We test a lot of these bikes, a lot of these field tests, and oftentimes if it's a suspension characteristic at the rear that I'm not a particular fan of, I can at least try and follow the fork, you know, and just basically kind of let the fork do the work and just let it, if it needs to do what it needs to do. But with this, I never even found like I could do that. There was kind of no northern star in terms of setup where I felt I ever really got a position where I got a handle on just making a bike confidently track on the front wheel. And to me, that is such a huge part of feeling confident.
Yeah, that's true. I'll like to dive back to the question, the recommended suspension setup, especially for the fork, really didn't work for me. I think the shock setup is fine. It's like, you know, you set sag, that worked for me. I ended up a good bit faster than the recommendation, but you know, that's gonna be anyone's shock setup stuff. On the fork end, I started with a recommended setup and found it like comically soft for me. I ended up over 20 PSI higher than that and was running the compression almost fully closed. And I think we were both chasing like a consistent fork feel, and I went for one that sacrificed a bit of grip just to maintain any ride height and try to keep the bike feeling stable through rougher sections. I think this is a trail bike. Despite having more travel than a lot of the others on the test, it feels a bit more in the traditional vein, and maybe kind of that's a good thing for some people.
It's funny actually, both Matt and Kaz said they found it more rewarding to ride when they were actually sort of riding it a bit more rearward.
Yeah, kind of like staying back seat felt more confident to them, which I kind of agreed with that, and maybe that's why my fork setup encouraged that body position. Like the firmer, higher-rised fork felt a bit safer to me. For
whatever reason, you know, I didn't find myself to be adaptable enough to just alter everything to get the most out of the bike.
Right, and you shouldn't have to.
Yeah, that's fair. Speaking of Matt, he's actually in the garage, tinkering away to tell us what this bike is like to live with.
Well, looking at this thing, it is quite the clean aesthetic. That's definitely one thing we've all regarded about this frame. Behind that though, there are some very tightly packaged pivots and bolts here. So if you did have to swap anything out, say bearings or just check the bolts, it does require dropping the shock. To make this change to the 27.5 wheel, you would have to remove a fair number of bolts, and it's a little bit more involved. That being said, with that tightly packaged link down here, they do have a nice little mud guard, and it was also claimed to be one of the quieter bikes on test. Moving throughout the frame, we do have a very nicely executed storage box on this frame. The overall size is maybe a medium in comparison to everything else here, but it is quiet. It does lock nicely in place with this lever, and we never had any issues with it whatsoever. There's a couple strange choices here. The rotors, the rear one is a 180, and both of them are the older style SRAM ones, so they're not as thick and they don't have quite the same bite. So that's one thing we did notice in comparison to the other bikes. Another couple components we have to talk about are up front on the bike. The first would be the in-house carbon bars from Ibis. They just felt really weird to all of us. They have a very strange up and back sweep to them, and no matter where we position them, we couldn't really get them to feel comfortable. They always felt like down or real back, just not like any of the other bars, a little bit strange. The second component we have to talk about on the front end of this Ripmo is the Fox 36 with the Grip X damper. Now, this one just felt a little bit different to us than the Grip X2, which has that 4-way adjustment, and we just had some more issues setting this one up and feeling comfortable on it. Overall, I'd rank the Ripmo pretty high on the livability score. We're gonna throw it back to the guys in the house and get their final thoughts on the Ripmo.
I'm gonna start off on a couple of the pros. I think this is a beautiful looking bike. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I've been describing it as the long lost Hemsworth brother. It's a very handsome bike.
Yeah, it just like the color is nice, the lines are great. I think it looks good.
Strong jawline.
Strong jaw.
Very strong
Truly. The other pro, I think for a certain subset of riders, it's gonna feel like what they want a bike to feel like. It's got this like energetic kind of encouraging sensation to it, and where we found that took away in some areas. I think if you want just something lively, this does offer that. But we had, I think, maybe more cons than pros on this.
Yeah, maybe. I think it's a bit of a throwback in terms of what the geometry feels like. It belies the geometry chart.
Right.
In terms of the ride sensation to what you think it's going to ride like. Secondly, I'd say setup can prove difficult. And
requires some weird concessions in order to get it feeling right.
And lastly, I would say that for those that want a 150, 160mm bike to be a true trail ripper, they might find that it's actually better at doing the things you typically think of a shorter travel bike to do.
With all those in mind, who is this bike for?
You know, I think in the same way that we talked about the Ibis enduro bike last year, the HD6, being basically like a trail bike for someone that wanted more travel, I think in this way, this is like the 130mm bike with a bit of extra safety.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It feels, it climbs on smooth terrain like a smaller bike does, and descends on harder terrain like a smaller bike does.
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
it has kind of a nervousness to it that I had a really hard time tuning out.
You could either describe this bike as a very sort of, to be honest, like underwhelming 150mm of travel, or a very sporty feeling 150mm of travel.
Yeah, I think like there's two sides to that coin for sure. So for the right person, maybe a bit more traditional approach to what they want a bike to feel like, this could be the one. But amongst the broader category we had here, it fell a bit flat.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for watching our review on this Ibis. Don't forget to subscribe to tune in with all the other field test content. And if you want to see our first impressions, then check out the behind the scenes videos to see us go into some pretty scientific tests, I'd say.
Oh yeah.
There were lab coats. NASA were already asking us for methodology.
I even got a haircut.
Even got a haircut. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.